The November rain fell steadily on the grounds of Walter Reed Army Medical Center as President Ronald Reagan made his way through the corridors of the military hospital. It was December 1987, and what was supposed to be a routine visit to wounded servicemen had turned into something much more profound, a moment that would resonate far beyond the sterile walls of the medical facility. Reagan had insisted on these visits throughout his presidency, despite the concerns of his Secret Service detail and the protests of his schedulers. He believed deeply that no American should shed blood in service to their country without knowing that their commander-in-chief cared about their sacrifice. Today's visit was particularly poignant, as many of the patients were young Marines and soldiers who had been injured in recent operations in Grenada and Lebanon. The president moved quietly from room to room, spending time with each patient, listening to their stories, offering words of encouragement, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence with those too injured to speak. His genuine warmth and interest in each individual had already made an impression on the hospital staff, who were accustomed to political visits that felt more like photo opportunities than genuine human connections. It was in the hospital's rehabilitation when that Reagan encountered Sergeant Michael Torres, a 22-year-old Marine from East Los Angeles who had lost his left leg to a roadside bomb in Beirut 3 months earlier. Torres was in the physical therapy room, working intensely with parallel bars, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled to master walking with his new prosthetic limb. When Reagan entered the room, Torres paused in his exercises but didn't immediately acknowledge the president's presence. The young Marine's jaw was set with determination, his focus entirely on the task of taking one more step, then another. The physical therapist started to interrupt the session, but Reagan quietly gestured for her to let Torres continue. For several minutes, the president simply watched as the young Marine worked through his rehabilitation routine. There was something in Torres' determination, his refusal to accept limitations, that reminded Reagan of his own struggles, not physical ones, but the mental and emotional battles he had fought throughout his life to overcome doubt and adversity. Finally, Torres completed his set and turned to acknowledge his visitor. His expression was respectful but guarded, showing none of the enthusiasm that Reagan typically encountered from service members. "Mr. President," Torres said, offering a crisp salute despite his position between the parallel bars. "Sergeant Torres," Reagan replied, returning the salute before extending his hand. "I've been watching you work. That kind of determination is inspiring." Torres shook the president's hand, but his expression remained somewhat skeptical. "Just doing what I have to do, sir. Trying to get back to my unit." Reagan's eyebrows raised slightly. "You want to return to active duty?" "Yes, sir. My brothers are still over there. They need every Marine they can get." The president studied the young man's face, seeing a mixture of courage, pain, and something else, a deep questioning that went beyond physical recovery. "Sergeant, would you mind if I sat with you for a few minutes? I'd like to hear about your experience, if you're willing to share it." Torres nodded and made his way to a nearby bench. Reagan sat beside him, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence. Two men from very different backgrounds, united by the gravity of military service and sacrifice. "Mr. President," Torres said finally, his voice carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone so young, "can I ask you something? And I want a real answer, not a political one." Reagan turned to face the young Marine directly. "Of course, Sergeant. What's on your mind?" Torres was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how to phrase his question. When he spoke, his words carried the raw honesty of someone who had stared death in the face and emerged changed. "Sir, I was raised Catholic. My grandmother made sure I went to church every Sunday, said my prayers, believed in God's plan and all that. But over there in Beirut, his voice catching slightly, "I saw things that don't make sense if there's supposed to be a loving God watching over us." Reagan remained silent, sensing that Torres needed to work through his thoughts. I lost 3 friends in that blast, Mr. President. Good men. Better me, probably. Rodriguez had a baby girl he'd never met. Martinez was going to propose to his girlfriend when he got home. Johnson was studying to be a teacher when his enlistment was up. Torres' voice grew more strained. Why did I make it, and they didn't? Where was God when that bomb went off? The young Marine looked directly at Reagan, his eyes reflecting a profound spiritual crisis. My grandmother keeps telling me it was God's will, that He has a plan. My chaplain says I should have faith that there's a reason for everything. But I can't make sense of it, sir. If God is real, if He's supposed to be good, why does He let such terrible things happen to such good people? Torres paused, then asked, the question that would change everything. Mr. President, do you really believe in God? And if you do, how do you reconcile that belief with all the suffering and evil in the world? How do you maintain faith when everything around you suggests that maybe we're just on our own out here? The question hung in the air between them. Around the rehabilitation room, other patients and staff had gradually stopped their activities, sensing that something significant was happening. Even the Secret Service agents seemed to lean in slightly, curious about how their boss would respond to such a deeply personal and challenging question. Reagan was quiet for a long time, longer than anyone had ever seen him pause before answering a question. His face reflected deep thought, but also something else, a profound empathy for the young man beside him who was wrestling with questions that went to the heart of human existence. Finally, Reagan spoke, his voice soft but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. Michael, may I call you Michael? Let me tell you about a moment that changed how I think about God and faith. Torres nodded, his attention completely focused on the president. It was 1981, just a few months after I became president. I was leaving the Washington Hilton after giving a speech, and as I walked to my car, I heard what sounded like firecrackers popping. The next thing I knew, I was being shoved into the limousine by my Secret Service agent, and I felt this incredible pain in my chest. Reagan's voice took on a more personal tone as he continued. I had been shot, Michael, and for a few minutes, no one was sure whether I was going to survive. As they rushed me to the hospital, I found myself thinking about many things, about Nancy, about my children, about the responsibilities I would be leaving unfinished. But mostly, I found myself thinking about a question very similar to the one you just asked me. The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in Reagan's story. Lying on that gurney, I wasn't thinking about politics or policy, or even about the man who had shot me. I was thinking about whether my life had mattered, whether the things I had tried to do had made any difference in the world. And I was wondering, just like you are now, whether there was really a God watching over us, or whether we were just random accidents in an indifferent universe. Reagan paused, looking directly at Torres. But then something happened that I'll never forget. As the doctors were working on me, preparing me for surgery, I saw the faces around me, nurses, doctors, Secret Service agents, hospital staff, and what I saw in their faces wasn't just professional competence or duty. I saw genuine care, genuine concern for another human being they barely knew. The president's voice grew stronger, more certain. In that moment, Michael, I realized something profound. The question isn't whether God prevents bad things from happening to good people. The question is whether, when bad things do happen, we choose to respond with love or with hatred, with compassion or with indifference, with hope or with despair. Reagan shifted slightly on the bench, turning to face Torres more directly. You asked me if I believe in God. Yes, I do. But not because I think He's some kind of cosmic puppeteer who controls every event in our lives. I believe in God because I see His presence in the ways that human beings respond to suffering, in the love that compels people to risk their own lives for others, in the hope that refuses to die even in the darkest circumstances. Torres was listening intently, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine engagement. Your friends who died in Beirut, Reagan continued. They were there because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed that freedom and justice were worth defending, that the lives of innocent people mattered enough to risk their own safety. That kind of love, that kind of sacrifice, that's not random, Michael. That's sacred. The president's voice took on a more urgent tone. And you, surviving when they didn't, that's not because God loves you more than He loved them. You survived because you have work left to do, because there are people who need what you have to offer, because your story isn't finished yet. Reagan gestured toward Torres' prosthetic leg. Look at what you're doing right now. 3 months ago, you nearly died. Today, you're fighting to walk again. Not so you can feel sorry for yourself or retreat from the world, but so you can get back to serving others. That determination, that refusal to give up, where do you think that comes from? Torres was quiet, clearly wrestling with Reagan's words. I think it comes from something deeper than mere survival instinct, Reagan continued. I think it comes from the same source that moved your friends to serve their country, the same source that moves doctors to spend their lives healing others, the same source that moves people to create beauty and seek truth and fight for justice, even when the odds are against them. The president paused, then continued with obvious conviction. Michael, I don't believe God caused that bomb to explode in Beirut. But I do believe God was present in the courage your friends showed, in the love that motivated their service, in the compassion that people showed you in your darkest moments, and in the strength that's driving your recovery right now. Reagan's voice grew softer, more personal. Faith isn't about having all the answers, son. It's about choosing to believe that love is stronger than hatred, that hope is more powerful than despair, that the human capacity for goodness is real and meaningful even in a world where terrible things happen. Torres was silent for a long moment, tears welling up in his eyes. But Mr. President, he said finally, how do you maintain that faith when you're responsible for sending people into harm's way? How do you sleep at night, knowing that your decisions might cost people their lives? Reagan's expression grew more solemn. That's the heaviest burden of this office, Michael. Every military decision I make, every time I authorize the use of force, I know that real people, people like your friends, people like you, might not come home. And I pray about those decisions more than any others. The president paused, his voice becoming more emotional. But here's what I've learned. The greatest act of faith isn't believing that God will prevent suffering. It's believing that when we face suffering, when we face loss and pain and seemingly impossible challenges, we can choose to respond in ways that honor the best of human nature. Reagan looked around the room, taking in the faces of other patients and staff who had gathered to listen. Look around this room, Michael. Look at the doctors and nurses who dedicate their lives to healing. Look at your fellow servicemen and women who are fighting through their own recovery with courage and determination. Look at your own refusal to accept defeat. That's not random, son. That's sacred. That's God working through human beings who choose love over fear, hope over despair, service over self-interest. Torres wiped his eyes, his expression showing a mix of emotions: grief, hope, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of peace. Mr. President, he said quietly, I want to believe what you're saying, but it's hard. Sundays. The pain, not just physical pain, but the pain of losing my friends, the pain of wondering whether any of this makes sense. It's almost overwhelming. Reagan nodded understandingly. I know it is, Michael. And I'm not going to tell you that faith makes that pain go away, because it doesn't. What faith does is give you a context for that pain, a way to transform it into something meaningful. The president leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. Your friends didn't die for nothing, son. They died because they believed that freedom and justice and human dignity were worth defending. Your recovery isn't just about getting your life back, it's about honoring their sacrifice by living in a way that makes their deaths meaningful. Reagan paused, then continued with obvious sincerity. And maybe, just maybe, your willingness to wrestle with these difficult questions, your refusal to accept easy answers, will help other people who are struggling with similar doubts and fears. Maybe your story of pain and recovery and faith will be exactly what someone else needs to hear. The room remained silent as Torres processed Reagan's words. Finally, the young Marine spoke. "Mr. President, I appreciate what you've said. I can't say that all my doubts are gone, but I think I understand better what faith might mean. Not blind belief that everything happens for a reason, but choosing to believe that our responses to what happens can have meaning and purpose." Reagan smiled, not his political smile, but something warmer and more personal. "That's exactly right, Michael. Faith isn't about having certainty, it's about choosing hope in the face of uncertainty. It's about believing that love and compassion and sacrifice matter, even when we can't see the bigger picture." As their conversation concluded, Reagan stood and placed his hand on Torres' shoulder. "Sergeant, I want you to know that your service, your sacrifice, and your struggle to find meaning in difficult circumstances, all of that matters. Your friends would be proud of how you're fighting to recover, and I believe God is present in that fight, even when it doesn't feel like it." The president prepared to leave, but Torres stopped him with one final question. "Sir, what should I tell my grandmother when she asks if I've found my faith again?" Reagan paused, considering the question carefully. "Tell her that you're learning that faith isn't something you find and then keep forever unchanged. Tell her that real faith grows through questioning, through wrestling with hard truths, through choosing hope even when hope seems unreasonable. Tell her that you're discovering that God might be less interested in whether we understand His plan and more interested in whether we choose to embody His love." As Reagan left the rehabilitation room, word of his conversation with Sergeant Torres began to spread throughout the hospital, then beyond. Staff members who had witnessed the exchange shared it with colleagues, who shared it with friends and family. Within days, accounts of the president's words had reached newspapers, television stations, and radio programs across the country. But the story that emerged in the media was different from the typical political narrative. This wasn't about Reagan's policies or political positions. It was about his deeply personal perspective on faith, suffering, and human resilience. The story resonated with people across political and religious lines because it addressed universal questions that everyone faced at some point in their lives. Religious leaders from various denominations praised Reagan's nuanced understanding of faith as something that grows through questioning rather than blind acceptance. Veterans organizations highlighted his recognition of the sacred nature of military service and sacrifice. Mental health professionals noted his acknowledgement that faith doesn't eliminate pain but can provide a framework for processing and transforming it. Most importantly, the story reached other people who were struggling with similar questions, other veterans dealing with trauma and loss, people facing serious illness or family tragedies, anyone who had wondered whether their suffering had meaning or purpose. Sergeant Torres himself became something of an unexpected symbol of faith, tested and refined by adversity. He eventually did return to active duty, serving as a military counselor, helping other wounded veterans process their own spiritual and emotional struggles. In interviews, he would often reference his conversation with Reagan, noting that the president had given him permission to have doubts while still maintaining hope. "He didn't give me easy answers," Torres would say years later. "He gave me a framework for living with hard questions. He showed me that faith could be strong enough to handle doubt, mature enough to grow through suffering, and practical enough to guide real decisions in the real world." The conversation between Reagan and Torres became a touchstone for discussions about faith and public life, demonstrating that religious belief could be both deeply personal and publicly relevant without being dogmatic or exclusionary. It showed that leaders could speak authentically about spiritual matters without imposing their beliefs on others or using faith as a political weapon. For Reagan himself, the encounter reinforced his conviction that his most important role as president wasn't just making policy decisions or managing international relations. It was connecting with individual Americans in their moments of greatest need and helping them find the strength to continue their own journeys. The story of that December afternoon at Walter Reed became part of Reagan's legacy, not because it revealed anything new about his political philosophy, but because it showed the depth of his humanity and his ability to find profound meaning in personal encounters. It demonstrated that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in the Oval Office or before television cameras, but in quiet moments between two people wrestling with life's deepest questions. Years later, when historians and biographers would analyze Reagan's presidency, many would point to moments like his conversation with Sergeant Torres as examples of his most significant contributions to American public life. He had shown that it was possible to lead with both strength and humility, to speak about faith without being sanctimonious, and to acknowledge suffering without losing hope. That the viral spread of Reagan's words about faith and suffering proved that Americans were hungry for leaders who could address not just their material needs, but their spiritual questions as well. In an era of increasing political polarization, the story served as a reminder that some conversations transcend partisan divisions and speak to the universal human experience of seeking meaning in the face of adversity. Most importantly, it showed that faith, whether religious or secular, could be a source of strength that didn't require the denial of difficult realities or easy answers to complex questions. Reagan's conversation with Sergeant Torres became a model for how public figures could discuss spiritual matters with authenticity, humility, and respect for those who might hold different beliefs. The lasting impact of that December afternoon wasn't measured in policy changes or political victories, but in the countless individuals who found in Reagan's words a way to wrestle with their own doubts while maintaining hope for the future. In a world full of simple answers and shallow platitudes, he had offered something rarer and more valuable: wisdom that could withstand scrutiny and faith that could grow stronger through questioning. For Sergeant Michael Torres, the conversation marked the beginning of a lifelong journey of faith that was marked not by certainty, but by the courage to keep asking questions and the wisdom to keep choosing hope. And for the nation that heard his story, it served as a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths are discovered not in grand pronouncements, but in quiet moments of human connection and mutual understanding.